Alright, we find ourselves in approximately the middle of nowhere, Montana to review this, the Canon 1D Mark III. This is a professional camera released in 2007 for some insane sum of money, and it's awesome. This camera was pretty advanced for its time. It has a 10.1 megapixel sensor up from 8 megapixels on the 1D Mark II, and it has 45 autofocus points, which is pretty decent. Although I won't get to test them because unfortunately the only lens I actually have for this thing is manual. But talking more about the sensor, this thing is actually pretty unique. This thing has a 1.3x crop APS-H size sensor. This was exclusive only to Canon cameras, and apparently it only existed because 1Ds needed to shoot really fast burst speeds, and these sensors were smaller than full-frame sensors. For example, the 1DS from 2002 was actually 11 megapixels with the full-frame sensor, but it only shot like 2 frames per second. Well, this camera could actually shoot like 12. Well, the only downside of shooting burst speeds is that if you use a slow SD card like this, it'll stay busy for a while. The other advantage of having a sensor that's smaller than full frame and bigger than APS-C is that this thing is actually surprisingly decent on low light. Even though this only has a max ISO of 3200, if you shoot in RAW, you can actually pull out the shadows really nicely. And I found that dynamic range is a nice sweet spot where it isn't too overbearing, but also totally usable even today. This camera also has a lot of creature comforts that professionals would appreciate. For example, on the back, there are actually 2 card slots. You have compact flash and SD support. SD cards were actually pretty slow back then, so it made sense to have a compact flash card as a number 1 slot. However, since this SD card is pretty decent these days, I use the SD card mainly, and this is only a 512 meg backup card. In addition, back here you get a much bigger LCD than the other 1Ds had, and a really big control dial, which is really nice to use, even with gloves on and stuff like that. You also have plenty of buttons for almost everything on the camera, which means that you don't have to sift through menus on like the camera I'm shooting on, the M6 Mark II. You have to go through menus for almost everything. And in some ways, this is a really good thing to have a ton of controls, but of course, if you're an amateur like me, you probably aren't going to even take advantage of all these. For example, I don't know what any of these ports are on the side, and I'm probably never going to use them. And in addition, this camera weighs like 4.5 pounds. This is definitely not your run and gun photographer's camera. But for the people who this was marketed towards, I can definitely see a lot of the advantages of having a nice professional body like this. You have the girth and the size that doesn't make your photos all shaky all the time. You have this nice LCD screen that a lot of even the Rebel cameras didn't have. You also have these controls everywhere, and also this camera is completely weather sealed. You can totally drop it in the snow out here and it wouldn't care less. And speaking of which, you might wonder how I got my hands on this, and this is because this was actually an eBay find. This thing looked like it had been thrown off a cliff in the listing and very well used. But when I got it, it actually ended up working just fine, really showing how resilient these cameras are. If I were to do that with my Rebel, its plastic body would probably crack immediately. Well, this thing is made out of pure magnesium. But obviously, professional cameras have advanced a lot throughout the years, so is a camera this old still usable in 2021? Well, we're about to find out. And you ever wish you just brought gloves? 'Cause I sure wish I brought gloves. But anyways, we can't stay here forever. Let's go shoot. Okay, so I've been kind of just like shooting random scenes around here. There's not a lot moving except for some birds, which I unsuccessfully captured because this is a manual focus lens. But I heard reports that the autofocus actually was rather good when it came out. And speaking of which, I forgot to mention what lens I was actually using on here, but this is a Nikon 35-70. This really isn't anything special. You can find these for like 15 bucks on eBay. But it is pretty decent for a camera like this that isn't super high megapixel count because it doesn't need to be super sharp. But it does leave you some limitations when focusing. The one disadvantage here is that, of course, you can see the environment we're in. We're not going to be able to test out the color reproduction of this camera much. However, I did shoot some photos with a lot of colors in them just for test, and you can see that the colors are actually really nice. And I would say that you're getting the really nice Canon colors, but let's be honest, Canon colors have changed a lot over the years. I'm talking about really classic Canon colors. It doesn't have the most dynamic range or mind-popping colors, but it has really nice, vibrant colors that I think are inherently cinematic looking, which is really cool from a camera like this. Also, something I just noticed is that despite having a useful exposure meter inside the viewfinder, it's actually pretty hard to judge exposure in a really contrasty white and black scene like this. And therefore, I found myself doing a lot of weird metering shots where I just took a shot, adjusted the exposure really quickly, took another, and hoped one of them was the correct exposure. This camera does actually have live view, but unfortunately it's not really that reliable because the LCD is low resolution despite being big and not really that color accurate. But 99% of the time the LCD is off to save power, and therefore you have to use the viewfinder for everything, which makes sense since this is a DSLR. In fact, I think there's literally a time limit on how long you can do the live view or else the sensor will overheat, not like you'll do within this environment. One feature on this camera that I kept forgetting I have, but I'm glad I have, is this. This thing actually has a shutter button on the other side of the camera, meaning that you don't have to like weirdly reach over to this side of the camera to take portrait shots. It's really helpful. Another really cool nice to have feature on these cameras is battery life. I mean, I failed to kill one of these things in a day, and I only have one battery for this thing, and I think this is really all that I really need. This is a really nice feature because you never want to be in the middle of a sports match or some intense situation as a photojournalist and miss a shot. If you're away from an outlet, you can reliably depend on even a couple of these batteries lasting you a very long time. And the other upside is if this camera is actually off, you can turn it on and get shooting almost immediately. There's no boot up time that you have with certain Canon cameras, like cinema cameras. And yeah, it's shots like these where I wish I brought a wider lens, like the one on my camera right now. So unfortunately, the rest of this video is gonna have to be filmed on my phone. And I'm probably just gonna get home, open these images, see how they look, because I cannot feel my hands right now. I really should have brought gloves, but anyways, I'll see you when we get there. You may notice that we're outside in this field again, and that's because I got home, opened all the pictures I took on this thing on my computer, and I realized that, what the hell, half these are out of focus. So yeah, we're gonna need to reshoot a lot of those photos because that obviously wouldn't cut it. So we're out here again. It's slightly warmer now, and I did remember gloves, so yeah, let's go shooting again and see if we can just try and get some better shots. Also, being the time of year it is, the sun will start going down in a couple of hours, so we might be able to get some really pretty sunset shots and really see if this camera can hold up in low light. I was saying this thing has good battery life, right? This thing's probably been on for like 4 hours and it hasn't dropped a single bar. That's impressive if you ask me. Alright, so we're basically waiting for the sun to go down here. That's about all we're doing is waiting. But I'd like to talk about the philosophy of a camera like this real quick, which might sound really boring if you're uninitiated, but in my opinion, I think it's something important to talk about when you're talking about old camera gear in particular. Because the new stuff is very highly technical. I mean, DJI just launched one of the most advanced gimbal cinema cameras in the world. The Sony a7 IV is awesome. I mean, seriously, you cannot go wrong with the camera these days unless you're being stupid, really. And I mean, to be clear, I own some really new gear. The camera I'm shooting this on is a Canon M6 Mark II, and I bought it because I wanted to have 4K video and a compact body. But when you're talking about photos, well, cameras have been around for literally hundreds of years at this point. There's a lot of options out there. And we might scoff at the Canon webpage calling this thing the most advanced camera in the world, 10 whole megapixels, I know, right? The original 1D was only 4 megapixels. But to be clear, this camera absolutely was amazing back in its heyday, and even now, really. Like, I feel like a different person when I'm hauling this thing around. I feel like I'm supposed to be respected. Unlike what I do when I'm carrying around my Rebel body. Professional cameras like this really just have a different vibe to them. And in a world where everything is becoming increasingly automatic and the DSLR is dying, really And think about it, what's the main barrier to entry for beginning photographers and videographers alike? I'd say it's price. Price is really just something that we can't deal with. Most normal people can't be dropping $300 on a new lens or $1,000 on a camera body. And it's also worth noting that this has almost always been the case. I mean, this camera when it came out was $5,000. I looked it up. That's insane. And if you find one for a really good price like I did, I think it was like $110 plus a battery and a charger. I think this investment will be incredibly worth it. Canon's EF mount is vast and wide in terms of lens options, and it has tons of flexibility. And if you ask me, if you're looking to get into something professional, granted, this is coming for someone who's not a professional, I think a professional camera body like this would actually do you better than something like a Rebel. Because even though this is older, if you show up to a wedding or something with one of these instead of like a chintzy little Rebel body, people will pay you more. And really, this camera is going to solve that barrier to entry problem for a lot of people, I think. Well, maybe not this camera in particular, but lots of ones like it. Because a lot of these older professional Canon bodies are going for pretty cheap on eBay. I mean, last time I checked, Canon 5D Mark IIs are like 500 bucks. That's an excellent price for a 1080p capable 21 megapixel camera. And keep in mind too, even though this is only 10 megapixels, keep in mind that the iPhone 13 Pro has only 12 megapixels, 2 more than this. And this thing can actually do fairly large prints that look very clear. But yeah, in general, the Canon 1D Mark III is very intriguing, and I've really loved using it over the past couple of days. However, all we have to really do now is wait for sunset. Man, I think I'll take some photos of that. Then we can get home and see how they edit. Alright, as you can see, we are outside now. We're kind of in the city too. And unfortunately, the rest of this video is basically going to have to be filmed on my phone because my camera is getting too cold for me to really handle, and it's like 18 degrees outside right now. So we're going to try to go down to the bridge where I think there's a fox that I featured in my Nikon P100 video that we might be able to capture. I'm not sure if it's out this time of year though. And unfortunately, even though it's only 4:30 p.m., there seems to be a lot of clouds around, and we're probably not going to get the best sunset pictures. Also, as the night goes on here, we're definitely going to be talking a lot more about low light performance from this camera, which I will note is not this camera's strong point. I found that I still have to be really careful with this camera despite its amazing capabilities, but to be fair, that's almost expected. So unfortunately, it looks like a sunset is not coming. We have clouds and we might even get some snow, so we're gonna have to go home. And so with that, we are home, and I think I'd like to close out this video with a bit of talk about how to edit these photos that come out of this camera. First of all, it's good to note that these photos are actually a lot more flexible than you probably think they are from such an old sensor. I think the most impressive shot I got was of this car crossing this stoplight, which, now that I realize it, he was probably running a red because there was a walking sign, but that's besides the point. Point is that I took this into the photo editor and managed to pull up all those details, and yes, there's grain, but there's a lot less of it than you'd expect there to be. And it's certainly not unserviceable at all. And many of these slightly underexposed shots I took in an effort to try to get something actually in focus were also easily editable into something very nice. The only thing I did notice was that in the shadows, sometimes there was this weird rainbow patchy effect, which is there, but ultimately not too big of a deal. So yeah, I imagine that even professionals today could get a lot of mileage out of a camera like this. Which begs the question, is this something I'd recommend in 2021? Well, as I alluded to earlier in the video, I say yes, if you're in the market for something that's like this. However, this is meant for a very specific type of person, if you ask me. Like, the person who wants to be a professional but doesn't have professional type money. Otherwise, I'd say that most people are probably actually better off getting some sort of cheap Rebel. But in any case, this is the Canon 1D Mark III, a 10 megapixel camera from 2007. And this is Calc G, out.